Hark, and well met, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another stream. My name is RuneMeisterKris, and tonight we have something special. It has been a long time since I posted a video to YouTube. A very long time, like months. And I wanted to break that with something classic. And that's the Revenge of the Archaeology streams. That's right, tonight we are going to be doing an actually educational, somewhat video, maybe, which I think will have some interesting things for us to discuss and talk about relating to archaeology, video games, the crux of what this channel is all about. Tonight, we are going to be reading a paper that I wrote in college. The paper is titled The Reality of Fantasy, a discussion of the differences between historical medieval combat and that of modern fantasy role-playing games. This was one of the first papers that I wrote before I became an archaeologist, before I donned the cloak and decided that I was going to study Vikings. Before I even went to the college that I was studying archaeology at. This is kind of where it all started, which is super cool. I'm glad that I found it, and I'm really excited to get back into it. I haven't read it. It's going to be kind of like a blind read, I guess, but but it should be pretty fun. Okay, should I hold it up? I have to see what I can see. It's dark in here. This new space, it's like you can't really tell with all this. It's a dark room. I just have the ring lights going and the fireplace in the back, and otherwise it's like a really dark room. Anyway, my eyes aren't what they used to be. I'm an old man now, getting old. Medieval Western Europe was an enthralling time period that inspired wonder, excitement, and magic inside those who associate themselves with it, including today's gamer culture. What was I thinking? This was written in 2010, 12 years ago that I wrote this. The creative minds of the early 1970s took all of those feelings, along with the history and culture of the Middle Ages, to create the first real modern fantasy role-playing game, Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D. Since then, the fantasy role-playing game phenomenon has become increasingly more diverse and popular. These games incorporate all the historical aspects of the Middle Ages. They accurately depict the arms, armor, and combat techniques used by warriors of the time. Soldiers and knights of modern fantasy role-playing games, or RPGs, can be easily recognized as such thanks to the characters' arsenals. It's not wrong. Additionally, medieval culture has been effectively reimagined. The roles and importance of religion have been glorified and embraced in these RPGs, making it a crucial aspect of playing these games. A specific religious branch that is present and relevant to modern RPGs is the Knights Templar. Oh God. Like I said at the start, hopefully this doesn't get cringe. The concept of holy warriors is an intricate and detailed aspect of modern fantasy RPGs. Finally, game designers have written into their games the cornerstone of what it means to play a character in a fantasy RPG, the heroic ideal. Finally, so I start the thing. The end of the introduction paragraph is with a finally. That was what is it, a summation clause? I think I learned that in high school. They always told me to like end the last paragraph of your introduction with finally. That was something that I did on every single one of my papers. Modern fantasy role-playing games clearly incorporate many themes from the Middle Ages. However, this paper will answer the question, how do the medieval themes in modern fantasy role-playing games differ from the historical combat of the Middle Ages? That's my question. That's the thesis question, right? While the similarities between modern fantasy role-playing games and medieval Western European culture are well established, there are some very extreme and important differences. It's one thing that I'm noticing about myself, thesis statement alert. One thing I'm noticing about myself in this is that I talk both simultaneously about how similar they are and how different they are. I'm like, oh my God, like modern RPGs incorporate exactly these elements of medieval culture. But also there are some key differences between the two. It's like, okay, 19-year-old Rune needs to pick one and make up his mind. Medieval fantasy is everything that people love most about the Middle Ages. I can't really speak for other people, but I don't think I'm wrong on that. One example of this would be the concept of magic. Modern fantasy RPGs take magic to its extreme. Witches, wizards, mages, and even some mystical monsters can bend the unknowable force of magic to their will in their efforts to do everything from conjuring food and drink to shooting fire from their hands. Just as important in the world of fantasy are the monsters, beasts, and creatures that inhabit it. Although dragons, trolls, fairies, elves, goblins, and the like are associated with the medieval era, they are far from real. In essence, the medieval fantasy that permeates modern RPGs exaggerates every detail that they adopt from the Middle Ages. That's not a bad thought. That's not a bad thought process. I'm like, yeah, all of the elements of the Middle Ages are in modern fantasy RPGs, just extra. RPGs have stronger heroes whose tasks are almost humanely impossible, and every danger threatens the fate of the entire world. Players can be stabbed, slashed, or burned and still fight strong. Wizards can travel between dimensions and summon great fiery meteors to crash upon their foes. Priests can mutter a few words and heal any wound or dismemberment, and even resurrect the dead. Fantasy RPGs exaggerate the themes of the Middle Ages to create a more enjoyable, interesting, and entertaining experience for the people playing them. Therefore, modern fantasy role-playing games incorporate many of the cultural and religious themes of medieval Western Europe into the combat of the games. Yet, they contain so much exaggerated and romanticized fantasies that they are clearly different from what was historically the Middle Ages. Oh, here we go. Here's a good sentence. The frame of this essay will include a variety of sources that describe the true nature of combat and general life in the Middle Ages. These include the works of Paul LaCroix, Eric Clayton and his fellows, as well as Peter Burkholder. I guess these are I'm like pre-citing my sources. These works will include the characteristics of all kinds of weapons and armor from that time period, as well as their functionality and styles of use. The goal of my paper is to contrast the combat of history and fantasy by, quote, telling the story of the knight through the arms and armor at his disposal. These works will include the characteristics of all kinds of weapons and armor from that time period, as well as their functionality and styles of use. The goal of my paper is to contrast the combat of history and fantasy by telling the story of the knight through the arms and armor at his disposal. The frameworks will give a description of many types of weapons and armor, as well as their different symbolisms, importance, and uses in medieval combat. Additionally, the frame contains information on the religious aspects of medieval life and how it impacted the life of the soldier, as well as the general concept of the heroic ideal and what it meant to be a hero. The heroic ideal is a huge writing point, and this was a writing class. This wasn't a history class. It was like a formal writing class. You're getting the sense of me using many words to say very little. Listen. It was a 10-page paper. You thought I was going to write 10 pages of actual paper? Why would I do that when I can write 10 pages of nothing? Or 8 pages of nothing and 2 pages of something? It's just got to be a good read. These sources will firmly establish the lifestyle of a historical medieval warrior for the reader. The counterframe will consist of a plethora of examples and information from modern fantasy role-playing games, drawn from the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook and the Dungeons & Dragons Complete Divine. Those are my 2 3.5 edition books that I cite. Through the fantasy and magical themes they possess, these games directly counter what it meant to be a soldier in the Middle Ages. The magic, monster, myths, and mystery that fill these games and separate them from the history and true nature of medieval combat is what the crux of this essay is about. Magic, monsters, myth, and mystery. That's my alliteration. That's my alliteration coming in super hard. I love alliteration. That's like one of my favorite writing tools. I alliterate the hell out of everything. The major cultural theme of the Middle Ages that is prevalent in modern fantasy RPGs is the combat. Combat is a very important cultural aspect of medieval Western Europe, and game creators draw heavily on it when designing these RPGs. The sword and shield style of combat that was used in medieval Europe is practically lost in today's technologically advanced world. One of the only things keeping it alive is its inclusion in modern fantasy RPGs. Where today's world uses guns and technology to fight from a distance, medieval combat was more melee-based, with some ranged weapons as well. Quote, the range of weapons used by all groups was generally similar. Swords, spears, bows and arrows, axes, hammers, with a knife or dagger. Combat was close and full of excitement, and required an immensely skilled and courageous soldier to brave the front lines. The same is true of characters from modern fantasy RPGs. Characters can use every weapon imaginable, from short, long, or great swords, to spears, halberds, javelins, to even axes, hammers, and maces. See Appendix 1. I am excited about this part. Appendix 1, and this is another thing that's going to date me here. This is the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition player's handbook. That's the weapons. That's the weapons that are available in that book. I loved pouring through the player's handbook and like the weapons tabs and everything. Honestly, I think like when I finished and I wrote this paper, I think I just kind of wrapped it up. Like, I can't believe that I wrote a paper where I got to cite. I'm gonna get to it at the end, because there's one particular thing on my works cited page that like had me rolling. Due to the intense physical combat, medieval warriors required a fair amount of protection as well. Soldiers were almost always equipped with sturdy shields for defense, while some of the more rich, skilled, or important warriors also donned chainmail coats or helmets. This is, I think, a little bit more. I was very generalizing at this point. I wasn't an archaeologist yet. This was taken very much from like the creative writing standpoint of a starry-eyed freshman. That was very applicable to some places, but not so much to others. Characters of modern fantasy RPGs require much hardier armor than those of medieval fighters. Fantasy armor has to be strong enough to deflect all manner of incoming projectiles, protect against magical energies, and withstand blows from powerful weapons. RPGs take all aspects of war and elevate them to a highly unrealistic state. Quote, there is much in these games that distorts the nature of medieval warfare. Their reliance of visual and auditory stimulation heavily emphasizes fire and explosions, and that would leave actual medieval soldiers perplexed. From Burkholder's, quote, popular misconceptions of medieval warfare. These games, in their attempts to cater to the modern fantasy themes of RPGs, incorporate a wealth of historically inaccurate elements into the combat that they portray. Not a wrong statement. An example of the inaccuracy of modern RPGs can be seen in the fantasized weapons and armor used by soldiers in modern games. In the Middle Ages, armor was, for the most part, fairly basic and rudimentary. Impressively adorned armors were reserved for only the most important people, such as kings. However, in the modern fantasy, massively multiplayer online role-playing game, MMORPG, World of Warcraft, WoW, that's something that you learn in like paper writing, and I do this in reports nowadays. You have to write out the entire thing before you can do the abbreviation. So I can't just come in and be like, oh yeah, in the MMORPG, I have to be like, in the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, aka MMORPG, World of Warcraft, aka WoW. Characters who have attained the highest level may wield weapons in the shape of dragons made entirely of ice that are roughly equal to their own size, while wearing monstrous metal plate armors that feature flaming skulls or 4-foot spines or magically floating pieces of stone or metal. Appendix 2. That is a funny sentence. That is a weird sentence to come out of a research paper. And then here's Appendix 2. Hold on, let me pull it up. Here's Appendix 2. A paladin in plate armor with a mace and shield from World of Warcraft. Which, to be fair, he is wearing some pretty fantastical looking armor. While in the Middle Ages, a towering knight, a quote, towering knight on horseback, was no doomsday weapon. The contrary is true of characters in modern fantasy RPGs. A single player can easily wipe out an entire village of enemies and come out unharmed. World of Warcraft. I cite World of Warcraft. I cite World of Warcraft on wiping out a village of enemies. Why did I say a village of enemies? A village is not where you would expect enemies to be. Am I the baddie? When you come in, you don't talk about a village of bad guys. You would say like a garrison or a base or a lair. I was like, oh my god, a village of evil farmers. And yes, I did cite World of Warcraft. That appendix was World of Warcraft. Clearly, fantasy has completely engulfed that aspect of the game. Granted, not all RPGs go to this extreme level of fantastic interpretation. In fact, a number of games feature rather faithful representations of medieval armaments, including fairly unimpressive weapons and armor, but they still show the typical fantasy exaggeration of modern games through the actions, feats, and magic that characters still incorporate into their fights. Dragon Age Origins. I am so sorry to BioWare. Look, Dragon Age is one of my favorite franchises. BioWare is one of my favorite gaming studios. I am so sorry for calling your character designs fairly unimpressive. I was a kid. I didn't know what I was saying. I was just talking. I was just talking out my ass. Anyway, I should do a Dragon Age stream. While fantasy arms and armor can sometimes have unrealistic external features, they also have fantasized spiritual features. I think I was trying to say like fantastical. Either way, they also have fantasized spiritual features as well. According to Eric Clayton, not to be confused with Eric Clapton, weapons had great meaning to warriors of the Middle Ages. In their presentation, they state that, quote, the sword was a symbol of great power, with warriors naming swords and passing them down through generations. So that part we've actually talked about. I've done TikToks on that. I've done a TikTok on Viking Age naming of their swords and the reasoning behind it and how they forged their swords and named them, and they were kind of like heirloom items, which is pretty legit. I might be getting ahead of myself, but it might tie into the fact of why like magic items and video games often feature swords that have names. Swords and other weapons were metaphors for a warrior's strength and knowledge. People of the Middle Ages believed that the older a sword, the more knowledge and strength it would have gained from its previous owners, and thus the more powerful the current owner would be. These weapons also had deep religious meaning. In the medieval era, the sword became, quote, a religious symbol, with the sword representing a cross and the two edges representing truth and loyalty, end quote. Modern RPGs take the historical ideas of holy and symbolic weapons and directly conflict with them. Directly conflict with them? Is that what I was trying to say? The Dungeons & Dragons Complete Divine, a player's guide to divine magic for all classes, describes magical relics and weapons that are conferred onto faithful mortals in their quests to fight for and further the goals of their chosen deities. One example of this is the Sword of Mighty Thews, Appendix 3, a weapon given to followers of the god Cord, the god of strength and athletics. Appendix 3, here it is. The Sword of Mighty Thews, scanned in from the Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 Complete Divine. The description of the Sword of Mighty Thews has religious meaning to followers of Cord, and gives them special powers when they wield it. The Complete Divine says that, quote, Cord's high clerics forged these great swords as homages to Cord's signature weapon, Kelmar. It renders its wielder immune to a dragon's frightful presence and confers a bonus against a dragon's breath weapon. Some people debate that modern RPGs do not fantasize the religious and spiritual elements of a soldier's weapon. Yet, while the weapons of the historic Middle Ages were metaphorically held in high symbolic esteem, those of modern fantasy RPGs have literally been imbued with actual divine spiritual power. The religious and spiritual fantasy of magical weaponry that is present in RPGs compared with the metaphors of historical Europe clearly show an exaggerated fantasy in modern games. I could have phrased that better. I feel like that was confusing writing. Water break. Why am I like this? The concept of religion has been greatly fantasized by modern RPGs, especially how it relates to combat. During the Middle Ages, Europe was united by the Catholic Church, who wished to, quote, restore the human race in all its dignity under the one true God. The primary way it did this was through the Crusades. Oh boy, here we go. A soldier driven by spiritual beliefs was much more determined than one who was fighting for no reason. For the medieval warrior, quote, ritual and superstition and or religious beliefs become interlocked with the pursuit of war. It moved subtly from fighting with the support of gods to fighting in the name of the deity. This aspect of religion plays a similarly important role in today's combat-oriented RPGs. However, once again, fantasy proves to be one of its primary features. Curiously enough, there are less monotheistic religions in fantasy RPGs than polytheistic ones. Despite the strictly monotheistic Catholic world of the well, I shouldn't say strictly Catholic world of the Middle Ages, but Christian certainly. The Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook simply says, quote, the gods are many, which is quite true. A thorough count referencing multiple D&D handbooks and sources will yield a number exceeding 100 gods and growing. I counted 100 gods plus. Did they number them in the books? I don't know how I feel about religion making warriors more motivated. It creates a false dichotomy between religious motivation and no reason, like there's not more reasons to fight. Of course there's more reasons to fight, but I'm not saying that that was the exclusive reason why they did that. Amelia, I'm not saying that that was the exclusive reason that they fought. I'm just saying that, look, if you went to the Middle Ages, if you went into the Crusades and you found, like, I guarantee there is going to be at least one clown in there whose exclusive reason for fighting is because he thinks it's going to get him into heaven. We are talking about the same time period where people were paying money to the church to get into heaven. They were literally rolling up to confession going, these are all my sins. By the way, here's a fat stack. Go buy yourself something nice. Bro, I know about the Crusades. I don't doubt you on that. I don't doubt you on that at all. It kind of implied exclusivity, but it was in the name of bullshitting a paper, so it's all good. Yeah, so what I think I was trying to say there is that people who were in the Crusades because, you know, the church wanted them to be there was a lot more convincing. By no reason we mean forcibly conscripted. Exactly. It's a lot easier to tell the peasant that you're rolling up to, like, they're just kind of working their farm, living their life, and all of a sudden the king, who they've never even like half heard of, like Monty Python, like who like, I'm king of the Britons. Who are the Britons? It's like, you're a Briton, you're also my vassal, and now you have to go fight in my war. Like, the people don't have a reason for that. They don't really care. Like, they wouldn't care to do that. But if you came to them and they're like, oh, the god that you worship wants you to go fight in this war, that's going to be an impetus for those people. I think that was the point that I was trying to make. I agree, mercenaries definitely fought for with more impetus than even like religious fervor. Well, I love the discussion. That's why I wanted to do this. We haven't had like a lot of good. I also like to stretch my like discussion muscles because I don't get to talk about medieval Europe at work anymore because I deal with American archaeology. I like talking about that. Where was I? Oh, right. I counted 100 gods. Here we go. A thorough count referencing multiple D&D handbooks and sources will yield a number exceeding 100 gods and growing. Each new edition brings with it more deities for its players to worship and serve. Gods of these RPGs are often warlike and drive the characters to do the tenacious and dangerous things that they often do. Each god has a signature weapon, which his or her followers also may use in battle to do everything from, quote, exacting revenge and just punishment on those who transgress the law, to, quote, being strong to cull the weak from their numbers, and to take all the territory that the god thinks is rightfully theirs. Gods. I almost exclusively played clerics in 3.5. I still play clerics a lot. Cleric is my favorite class. But I almost exclusively played clerics in 3.5. Not just because I thought that divine spellcasters were strong AF, but also just because they were so good. It was so interesting to play clerics in 3.5. It's not my fault I murder hobo. My god told me to do it. There's a deities and demigods handbook for 3.5. There totally is. Give me a second here. What am I looking at? These are my old D&D books. Here we go. 3.5 Complete Divine. Anyway. Let's get through this. However, a lot of newer role-playing games are doing away with multiple gods and basing their in-game religions on a singular maker, like in Dragon Age Origins. Although this is slightly more realistic, these games still incorporate the fantasy violence that is prevalent throughout all RPGs. One of the primary religious and violent figures in both medieval Western Europe and modern fantasy RPGs is the Templar. However, the Templar of the Middle Ages are very different from those present in modern fantasy RPGs. The Complete Divine describes the pious Templar character as a, quote, holy warrior blessed by her deity with combat prowess and great endurance. She bears her deity's favorite weapon into battle and fights her deity's enemies without question or hesitation. These Templar clearly exhibit features of fantasy due to the fact that they are given divine powers and abilities by their gods so that they can fight the good or evil fight. The Templar of the modern RPG Dragon Age Origins are religious soldiers whose blind devotion to the church, or chantry, as well as their ambitions to rid the world of evil, are clearly influenced by the historical Templar of the Middle Ages. However, where the Templar of medieval times were trained as religious soldiers, the Templar of Dragon Age are almost strictly trained to guard and hunt mages. Appendix 4. Rid the world of evil, control magic users. Exactly. Same thing, right? Appendix 4. Let's go. A Templar, right. Guarding 2 mages in Dragon Age Origins. It's like, I wonder which one is meant to represent the Templar Knight. Is it the large, bulky gentleman in the massive silver armor? Or is it the nerds sitting in their dresses? You tell me! DA Templars did also wear skirts. Yeah, you're actually 100% right about that. I take it back. They're both nerds in skirts. Mages, or anyone with the ability to control and wield magic, are considered by the Chantry to be dangerous abominations who wish to overthrow the Maker and control heaven. Therefore, they are controlled and guarded by the Templar, who are trained with special anti-magic combat abilities. This instance shows how themes of the Middle Ages have been distorted and fantasized by modern RPGs. The religious influences on medieval combat have clearly been distorted by today's fantasy role-playing games, as can be seen in the warlike deities of D&D and the Templar of Dragon Age Origins. I used distorted in 2 consecutive sentences, and now I feel like I've ruined the night. I'm reading this and I'm like, proofread. If that's the biggest gripe that I have about this paper, I'll consider it an okay time. Battle-hardy heroes were an important part of the medieval culture. Hardy warriors who proved themselves in Hardy again? I used hardy in 2 consecutive sentences? What is wrong with me? It's fine. We're good. We're good. I have words and they fixate in my brain and I use them multiple times, I guess. I just figured that it fit. It fit both sentences, so I should use it twice on the same line. On the same line of the paper. Hardy warriors who proved themselves in battle or intelligence were honored and glorified for generations. One such hero was Beowulf the Great. We're getting into the historic myth now, rather than the video game myth. There was no one else like him alive. In his day, he was the mightiest man on earth, high-born and powerful. Beowulf had all the qualities of people of the Middle Ages desired: strength, nobility, courage, riches, and glory. Modern fantasy RPGs take these heroic qualities and push characters to their extremes. Through the course of the average RPG, players will face challenges, quests, and obstacles that would stop even the hardy Beowulf in his tracks. Most of the quests from the MMORPG World of Warcraft involve a player killing or collecting items off the corpses of upwards of 30 people per quest, and sometimes even more. That is a bitter player. That is somebody who had to grind fetch quests for hours and hated it. That's me saying, damn you, Blizzard, and your time sink of a game. Groups of 3 to 5 players can confront and defeat an entire army and not lose a single man in the process, and upon their return be treated as if it were all in a day's work. Citing World of Warcraft. In the Middle Ages, it was difficult for a man to kill 30 men in his entire lifetime, let alone in a couple of hours. Yet, the players of modern fantasy RPGs can swat enemies like flies. Every challenge they undertake must be more epic than the last, culminating in a final battle, which rivals them all and decides the fate of the entire universe. And I cited Dragon Age Origins on that one. Which is not wrong. It's not exclusive, but it's not wrong. Reality is too boring to be put into a game. So fantasy is incorporated as to make combat more exciting. Not even Beowulf, whose worth and due as a warrior were the greatest, can stand up to those that characters of modern RPGs create. Fantasy has encompassed and permeated every aspect of the heroic ideal that personified the perfect warrior, to the point that it is not only unrealistic, but also humanely impossible. The fantasy of modern RPGs also incorporates a lot of inhumanely impossible aspects in their combat. This is the start of the new paragraph after the last words of the last paragraph were humanely impossible. God, 19-year-old me couldn't write for He was a dummy. The fantasy of modern RPGs also incorporates a lot of inhumanely impossible aspects into their combat. Chief among these are the monsters and creatures one often encounters in their travels. Appendix 5. What's at Appendix 5? This is a good one. Appendix 5 is the size chart from the 3.5 era book. It's a good scale. I was meant to show like the wide variety of people. The size charts are so good. They were so much fun. There has been very little evolutionary change in the wildlife between the Middle Ages and now. Therefore, the most fearsome non-human encounter in medieval Europe would be stumbling across a bear in the woods. However, bears are a mere warm-up for characters of fantasy RPGs. A fairly well-developed character will be more likely to encounter a wide variety of mystical, fearsome, and deadly creatures. In Dragon Age Origins, the bulk of a player's fighting is targeted at Darkspawn. Darkspawn are ferocious and mindless war machines whose sole purpose is to kill and destroy. The Darkspawn are led by the Archdemon, a banished god that has possessed a dragon. Before their Dragon Age journey has come to a close, players will slay hundreds of Darkspawn and the Archdemon, with the help of maybe 3 others. Throughout the campaigns of World of Warcraft, players battle through countless different animals, humanoids, and monsters to victory in their land of Azeroth. Then, in its first expansion campaign, they venture into the astral plane of Outland to defeat the demonic Burning Legion. World of Warcraft, the Burning Legion. Before finally, in the most current expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, turning their eyes into the wintry tundra of Northrend to defeat Arthas the Lich King and his undead scourge. Wotlik was the current version of World of Warcraft that was out when I wrote this paper. That was my most played expansion. Wrath of the Lich King was my World of Warcraft. That was when I played the most. Dungeons and Dragons has multiple volumes describing the plethora of monsters, beasts, and creatures that stand in the way of fantasy RPG characters, forcing them to sometimes, quote, surprise and sneak attack a troll. Due to the irrefutably unreal foes that challenge the characters of modern RPGs, it is obvious that the combat of the Middle Ages has been made very unrealistic by the fantasy that these games incorporate. You can see I'm really hammering home the point that modern fantasy RPGs are not historically accurate. Who knew? There is, however, one realistic quality that drives historical and fantasy warriors, and that is greed. Wow. Oh, that's a brutal that's a brutal burn to all those people. I'm sorry, Middle Ages soldiers. I didn't seem to think that greed. I'm sorry if you had reasons other than greed. I mean, I bet the paychecks were like, a big part of it. I mean, that's the reason why we do anything, right? If you're getting paid. But damn, maybe greed is a little brutal. Soldiers of the Middle Ages, just like the characters and players of modern fantasy RPGs, were usually trying to achieve monetary gain. Whether that was in the form of governmental land grants or just picking up whatever valuables they found, money was a good reason to be a soldier. Jesus Christ. This is a controversial take. This is a hot take out of 19-year-old Rune, let me tell you. Medieval soldiers were opportunists. Oof. Gotta get that bread, right? Jennifer Lang said that the life of a medieval warrior was, quote, colored by the desperate search for booty and honor. That's... Booty could go either way there. Probably not. Probably it was... I think she meant it like pirate booty. Pirate loot. Pirate treasure. I'm 30 years old and I'm laughing about booty on the internet. Viking costume. If you told me when I wrote this paper, if you told me when I was 19 and wrote this paper that one day I would be on the internet dressed like a Viking, reading this paper to people on a stream while my son slept, laughing about booty, I would have said that tracks. It was not unusual for soldiers fighting in faraway lands to pick up a side investment from a ransacked house along the way. The same is true of modern fantasy RPGs. Quote, when characters undertake adventures, they usually end up with some amount of silver, gold, gems, or other treasure. These rewards might be ancient treasures that they have unearthed, the hoards of the villains they have conquered, or pay from a patron who hired them to go on the adventure. However, the trinkets and coins that historical soldiers looted was dirt compared to the riches that characters in RPGs plunder. Gold, gems, and magic items almost flow out of every slain foe in the path of a fantasy hero. This aspect of medieval treasure hunting shows just how much modern fantasy RPGs exaggerate historical medieval themes. All of these themes of the Middle Ages that have been adapted into modern role-playing games are recognizable, but very different. Medieval combat featured basic and effective weapons and armor. Yet today's RPGs display overly grand and mystical armaments that would have never even been dreamed of during the Middle Ages. Similarly, the spiritual and religious aspects of a soldier's life have been blown out of proportion by the incorporation of magic and polytheistic divine warrior religions that were not present in the real medieval era. These games have even taken historical figures, namely the Templar, and given them mystical and godly powers that only exist in fantasy. The tasks, missions, and quests that the characters featured in modern fantasy RPGs undertake push the heroic ideal beyond its extreme. Monsters, creatures, demons, and undead lurk behind every corner in the world of fantasy, while historic fighters only had to fear their fellow man. Nothing is too epic for the character of a modern RPG. Not to mention the overabundance of gold that awaits any willing fantasy hero. There is no doubt that medieval culture has influenced and is present in modern fantasy RPGs. However, the fantasy aspect of these games is taken to such an extreme extent as to produce a clear distinction between life in the Middle Ages and that within a modern fantasy role-playing game. And that's the end of the paper. We did it. So now we get to talk about the funniest part of this. And let me show you it right here, because I was skimming through this earlier before we came on, and I wanted to show you it because it's actually the funniest thing that I think I've seen on this paper so far. Some of you may recall that earlier in the paper, when I was going through the appendices, I showed off this Appendix 2, which features a paladin in full like raid or PvP gear from World of Warcraft, probably Burning Crusade or vanilla. I literally in a college paper had to cite the source as this: armored paladin, and then the web URL, which ends with kickasspaladin.jpg or JPG. Kickass paladin had to go in the works cited of my paper, which I think just tells you all you need to know about college. World of Warcraft, the game. World of Warcraft Burning Legion, the game. World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King, the game. I padded the bibliography by citing World of Warcraft 3 times. I just cited the same game 3 times. I was the goat. I was the goat at making stupid papers seem smart. Why? It's phenomenal.